This is just about the most northern point in this part of England, because behind me you can see the Solway First, the southern shores of it. The further side, the hills that you can see beyond me, are in Scotland. Today, this area, known as Burgh Marsh, is a fairly lonely, wild, desolate place. But 700 years ago, it was throbbing with activity. I want you to imagine those flats behind me crowded with perhaps 20,000 men or more, because this was where King Edward I had led his army, and they were camped down there. A profusion of royal pavilions, of tents for the nobles, with the knights sitting outside, relaxing, while their squires attended to the horse or polished the armour or sharpened the sword, and all around the humbler shelters and campfires of the common soldiers. Welsh bowmen, billmen, pikemen, all the various types of weaponry that made up a medieval army. The year is 1307, and King Edward I is on his way to Scotland. Edward was a remarkable monarch, a ruthless conqueror, a man who inspired fear in those who knew him, but also respect. He was a great lawgiver. He seems to have genuinely felt that he was doing the best, not just for himself, but also for his people. He conquered Wales, ruthlessly stamping out all Welsh resistance, and putting the Welsh leader, Dafydd, to death in the most brutal manner imaginable in Shrewsbury. And then he was confronted with Scotland. It must have seemed to him a very similar situation. The nobles of Scotland were disunited, the people were divided into warring clans, and he was able to step in and, by a process of astute diplomacy, by playing one party against the other, he was able to establish his own influence in Scotland as paramount. But somehow it all went wrong. The conquest of Scotland wasn't nearly as easy as he had imagined. First of all, you had William Wallace, the great patriot, who rose up against the English puppet and fought a decisive battle, or series of battles, against the English. Eventually, William Wallace was tracked down by the English forces, captured, carted down to London, given a public show trial. There was a real travesty of justice, and put to death again in a brutal and shameful manner, hung, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. But when William Wallace was gone, along came another leader sprung up to take his place, and this was Robert the Bruce. And again, Edward led his armies north into Scotland. He defeated Robert the Bruce, but it did no good. Robert the Bruce escaped to an island off the coast, discouraged, and there met perhaps the most celebrated spider in history, whose continued attempts to spin its web encouraged him to come back and keep on struggling against English domination. And so, with English settlement in Scotland unravelling, Edward I once more summoned his army and set out for the north. By now he had earned himself the title Hammer of the Scots. He was too weak to ride, too old to walk, and so he was carried in a litter, his indomitable will driving him forward to once more hammer those recalcitrant Scots and establish English domination. But when he came here, to Burgh-on-Sands, with his royal pavilion pitched down there, his old age, his weakness overcame him, the bad food, the bad water. There was an inevitable consequence of an army on the march, caught up with him, and he lay here, sick of dysentery. And about him the army, sombre, apprehensive, because the doctors said that Edward was dying. The dramatic events that followed are commemorated by a monument down there on the very spot where they happened. Let's go down and have a look. It's very lonely out here on Burgh Marshes beneath this vast expanse of blue sky. with the wide marsh and beyond the rolling hills of Scotland. And though there were 20,000 men here in 1307, it was still lonely for one man. It was very lonely for King Edward, because every man is alone on his deathbed. And I wonder what thoughts went through his head as he lay dying. Did he perhaps regret the slaughter that he had carried out, the cruelty he had showed? Did he regret his greed for power and temporal dominion? Somehow it seems unlikely, because his dying wish was that his body should be boiled and his bones carried at the head of his army into Scotland to complete the conquest against Robert the Bruce. He did have some thought for his soul, because he ordered that 100 knights were to carry his heart into the Holy Land as sort of a recompense, a restitution, a making right what he had done throughout his life. But somehow, even if his wish had been carried out, I doubt that that would count much with God. Did he perhaps know in his final moments the futility of his son, Edward II, who was to spend the rest of his short life enjoying himself with his boyfriends, engaged in crafts more suited to a villein, a farm worker? Scotland was never conquered, not by Edward II, nor any of the succeeding monarchs. And so today this monument stands here, on the spot where on July 7th, 1307, Edward I Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots, died, and where all his hopes and dreams of conquest came to an end. Jesus said, "What will it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" And I could ask you that question. What will it profit you if, like Edward I, you rule a vast domain? If you have the world at your beck and call, if you have all the riches of a kingdom to dispose of? What will it profit you in that moment when you lie dying, when the last great loneliness confronts you? When you go into the dark knowing that you are leaving everything that you have worked for to others who perhaps will not care about it, will let it go to rack and ruin, who will not even remember you. This monument was erected in 1686, was restored in 1863, and today it stands as a monument to one of England's greatest kings, but also as a monument to the folly and futility of man. Edward I has his monument here, far from London, far from his home, far from his family. His monument marks a spot where he died alone, and all his hopes and dreams came to nothing. Because the only thing that is worthwhile in anyone's life is what Jesus spoke about. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his own soul? And what will a man lose if he loses the whole world but gains his soul and eternal life in heaven? That is the true riches. That should be the true ambition of every man and woman on earth.